Hello, I'm Dan Gibson, and this is the last video in a 6-video series addressing Dr. King's paper, The Petra Fallacy. If you haven't watched the first videos in this series, I would suggest you start with the first video and watch the whole series. I also suggest you have a copy of his paper. I also suggest that you watch the film, The Sacred City, and some of the other things that I've done before that, so you will be up to speed of what this is all about. In the latter part of his article, Dr. King presents a criticism of my methodology. He starts this way. He says, "My main complaint against Gibson's methodology is that he believes with all his heart that modern directions towards Petra and or Mecca are somehow relevant to our understanding of the orientation of early mosques." The answer to this is simple. I wanted to test the Qiblas of all the mosques of the first 200 years of Islam and see what I could learn from them. I had accepted the meaning of the Qibla as the one that all the Muslims used up until now, that it was facing Masjid al-Haram, the original place. The Quran and every Muslim writer from the first century of Islam has always related the Qibla to Masjid al-Haram. Never was the Kaaba ever included in the whole idea of orientation. I've never seen that in Islamic literature. Yet this idea was presented by medieval Islamic writers 500 years after the founding of Islam as their reason to explain the early Qiblas. Friends, if the original Muslims, the Prophet of Muhammad and the companions of the Promise, used a variety of Qibla definitions, then why were there changes later in the medieval times? Why did people want to change? If Dr. King's theory is right, why should they ever redirect or rebuild mosques? Why tear down the one in Wasit and redirect it towards Mecca? Not only is the idea absurd, the idea is not even true about when mosques' direction changed. As I mapped Qiblas, it becomes apparent that Qiblas facing Mecca started around 720 AD, and by 800 AD they were the norm. The change from Mecca took place 100 years before the mathematicians ever came along on the scene. So over the next 300 years, they are writing and wondering about what happened way back in the first part of history, but during their lifetime, all the mosques being built during their lifetime, and 100 years before their lifetime, all faced towards Mecca in Saudi Arabia. They assumed that the only accurate way of setting a Qibla direction was by using modern mathematics. That is what Dr. King echoes today. Dr. King says the ancients and the medievals did not have access to modern geographical coordinates, nor did they have access to the exact procedures for finding the direction of one locality to another. And I agree, the earliest Muslims did not have geographical coordinates like latitude and longitude. They did not have the mathematics to work out the formulas for finding the Qibla direction. I agree with Dr. King on this, but we disagree because I think they did have other methods they could use, but Dr. King cannot accept that any other methods might have existed beforehand. Dr. King says, to use pre-modern coordinates in such an investigation is no task for an amateur like Gibson. Whatever he might have used in the way of ancient Greek Ptolemaic coordinates would be inaccurate, especially given that the Greek value for the length of the Mediterranean was in error. And the first coordinates in Muslim sources appear in Babylon about 825. Again, I agree with Dr. King. I've studied this out. I have read the accounts of when the Greek maps with their inaccuracies appear in the Caliph's courts. And the Arabs were quite surprised and taken back by this system of worldwide coordinates, latitude and longitude. It was developed by Ptolemy, and by 800 AD, the first maps were being made available in Arabia, and they were fascinated by this idea of coordinates, and that's what the mathematicians then took and ran with. So, yes, they did not have latitude and longitude and everything. They had their own methods, but they didn't have this system I agree with Dr. King on that. But he thinks then there was nothing, there was a vacuum, and I don't think so. Dr. King then moves on to his main argument. Another problem I have with Gibson's interpretation of his data is that he desperately needs to rewrite the history of mathematical geography, albeit with a cop-out. Now, notice how he words this. Dr. King, he notes this. He says, Gibson desperately needs to rewrite the history of mathematical geography. The answer is no. It's not about mathematical geography. Dr. King just cannot imagine that the earliest Muslims could set a Qibla without using mathematical geography, without things like longitude. He has spent so many years studying the mathematical geography that he cannot get himself outside of that way of thinking. I strongly believe that the early Muslims had methods to accurately calculate Qiblas. Just because we don't know for certain which method they used doesn't make it impossible or even improbable that they managed to do it. I don't for a minute believe that the Arabs used Ptolemy's geographical coordinates, or Greek or Indian trigonometry, or astrolabes. I've never suggested this. Or that they even had geometrical and trigonomical solutions. Dr. King cannot think beyond these modern mathematical solutions to the Qibla. Therefore, he denies that the Qibla measurements that I took have any bearing whatsoever on the issue. For him, it is impossible to set a Qibla without advanced mathematics. Therefore, he denies that the Qibla could be found, and anything that I found is totally irrelevant. It's just by chance. That's fine. It's his theory. He has his right to his own opinion. But as I have observed the 4 different classifications of the Qibla in the first 200 years of Islamic history, I think the odds that they are just by chance are phenomenal. Phenomenal. I have approached mathematicians and experts in mathematics and in statistics to try and calculate what some of those odds would be, and it's in the billions, 1 to billions, that 20 mosques would happen to face Petra when they didn't intend to, or that 20 more mosques would face a position between Mecca and Petra, and so forth. That this would just happen. Dr. King's theory does not explain this phenomena. It only denies it. He tells me that my observation is just chance. It's just chance that when General Hajjaj builds his first mosque, that it faced just exactly between Petra and Mecca. Just chance, he called it the between mosque. Just chance that all over the mosques built during his time he was in control of his part of the Islamic world would face that direction. Just chance that they would have the exact same Qibla. Just chance that as soon as Hajjaj died, new mosque construction would no longer face that direction, but it would change and it would begin facing Mecca in Saudi Arabia. Just chance that all of this happened, and yet it's still several hundred years till the mathematicians show up. Dr. King doesn't read Islamic history. He doesn't pore over the early accounts of Islam, not in Arabic, not even in English. He reads the medieval manuscripts, and he 100% supports their ideas, even though they wrote some 300 to 500 years after the event took place, and when they are obviously saying so-and-so says this and so-and-so says this, but my opinion is this, and he sort of agrees with everybody. Now, Dr. King goes on and he says, at my advanced age, I have no time to waste writing this crackpot theories like this of Dan Gibson. Nevertheless, I feel I must write these few pages trying to show how crazy and potentially dangerous they are. There's quite a lot of repetition in these pages, but I cannot stress enough the inappropriate procedure Gibson has used and the unfortunate and totally false conclusions he has reached. Friends, I mentioned in my books and on the YouTube videos that the definition of Qibla is very important to Muslims and their faith. Dr. King interprets this as inappropriate and as Islamophobic, although I am trying to use the Islamic definitions. And at this point in his paper, he starts on the likes of Tom Holland and Dr. J. Smith and Dr. Rick Oakes and another author, Ahmed Amini, of whom he says, sadly, his book will probably be read with enthusiasm by unsuspecting French-speaking Muslims. After several pages, Dr. King notes that these writers simply asked Gibson that Gibson's theory get an airing. That's what most of them have said. You know, don't just destroy it. Just allow this theory to have an airing. Dr. King then bashes Edward Murray Gallas, who says he's fallen for Gibson's thesis, as they say, hook, line, and sinker. The pages roll on with things said about these writers and their stupidness for supporting Gibson and his crackpot theory. In the middle of this, King notes that in my book on early Islamic theories, where I say I thank one of the leading archaeoastronomers of the Near East, Professor Gian Antonio Belmonte, whom Dr. King seems surprised that his name was found in my book. Let me explain. During my research, I corresponded with Professor Belmonte, and he as he has investigated how the Arabs of Petra and other ancient sites seem to accurately orient their structures to some celestial points. Although he doesn't explain how they did this, he does note the interesting phenomena. Dr. King has no problem with Professor Belmonte, whom he calls proudly my colleague, but since Professor Belmonte doesn't explain how they calculated these alignments, I did not include his research in my book. I simply introduced him, included him in the section that started. This is how I titled the section. I would like to dedicate this book to the many people who have enriched my research and have influenced my thinking over the years. And I list their names in alphabetical order. And I have a copy of Professor Belmonte's positive reply when I asked him if I could include his name in that list. I don't know what Dr. King is getting all bent out of shape over when I list this scholar's name, even though I do not mention archaeo or ethnoastronomy. Next, Dr. King turns his attention to the Qibla tool that was posted on the internet, which we've seen. The address is up there. He starts with this. At first sight, this is most useful and could put an end to some of the often silly controversy that has been raging about early mosque orientations. A Google Map image of the whole medieval Muslim world shows the location and the orientation of all the earliest mosques. Thank you. But then he warns, be careful though, for this two-dimensional representation of a substantial swath of the Earth's surface, producing a principal axis of the mosque as straight lines halfway around the world, nay, across the flat world, is in itself ridiculous and can lead to more confusion. Okay, let's clarify again, folks. The folks at Google, I contacted them and they told me they use a sphere, that this is based on a sphere, not flat maps. As you zoom out, the map appears flatter because that's what we're used to. As you zoom in, it becomes more and more and more the sphere that it actually is. They use the WGS84 data model, and so the maps resemble a sphere, and the lines that are plotted on a sphere. Now, perhaps Dr. King is thinking about plotting the closest direction between two places. That was not my concern. My concern was measuring the direction that the actual building was facing on the ground. That is why I visited so many of these mosques and took measurements from them, including the mosques in question in China. King goes on to comment, the map will appeal to enumerate and cardiographically innocent revisionists who will think it proves Gibson's theories. The map is guaranteed to confuse folks who have no idea about the mathematics of cartography, so that they will believe in the directions they see on the map. Okay, that's what he's saying. What is he saying? Okay, what is he saying? He says that ordinary folk will think this map supports my theories. They will think that this because they don't know the mathematics of cartography using latitude and longitude, and they will not know about Dr. King's theory. King tells us the map in Palestine shows all south-pointing Qiblas because they were north of Mecca. So that makes it look like they were all pointing south. So King doesn't have to measure any mosques because they all just pointed south. Or, of course, they were north, so they pointed south, because if they were north of Mecca. And if they're east, they pointed west, and if they're west, they pointed east. But here's my question. Is it true that all mosques north of Mecca, do they all point south? Here again is my Qibla tool. Let's type in Yamama. And then let's go down, zoom in. This mosque is north of Mecca, and so it should point south down to Mecca. But surprisingly, it still points north. It's between Petra and Mecca, but it points towards the between position. It was built during the lifetime of General Hajjaj, who was the ruler of this part of the Islamic world, who pointed all his mosques between Petra and Mecca, and who called his own mosque the Between Mosque. I find that it fits perfectly, but it flies in the face of King's theory. It is pointing directly to the between position, yet it is south of Petra and north of Mecca. It should be pointing north. But King is off on another tangent, this time the Qibla direction in North America and its problems, and sometimes something that's totally irrelevant. I'm not sure why he's bringing up this whole idea of Qibla directions in America, because America wasn't even on the thought of Muslims when they began this. Then he jumps to the writings of A. Dus, whom I consider to be a heretic rather than a supporter of mine. I think he's a critic of mine. And Dr. King, he goes on and on about his writings and about the Qiblas, and in the end Dr. King makes an appeal to further research. Now this is most interesting. He asks that future researchers check out his theory. He wants future researchers to find out if the facts actually match what he's been telling us. He asks future researchers to find out the following information. Now note this list. I find this fascinating. He's totally sold on his theory, but he asks, can you please check these things? Determine which mosques were built on the authority of the Prophet or his companions. Oh, really? That's quite easy to determine. Determine which mosques were built on the foundation of or within line with pre-Islamic religious architecture, which happened to be cardinally aligned, that is north, south, east, and west. Ignore the rest, just find those which are cardinally aligned. Determine which mosques were built according to the street plan of pre-Islamic cities. Then he says, please determine which mosques were built towards winter sunrise and towards winter sunset, or towards some other astronomical horizon phenomena. And then he says, number 5, determine which mosques face more or less due south in Jordan or Syria. And then he says, number 6, determine which mosques face due west in India and due east in North Africa. And number 7, determine which mosques are more or less due north in Yemen and in South Africa. My goodness, you mean Dr. King is fanatically supporting a theory and he's not done this basic, very basic research? He couldn't even list all of the mosques until he saw my list. He had only talked about 3 or 4 or 5 mosques until I came up with my list of over 100. He tells us that these things are true, and then he lists just 1 or 2 mosques for each example. My goodness, he's never even done the research to check out if this is actually the case in all of the mosques. I can tell you exactly how many mosques face each direction. I can even tell you that one mosque faces Jerusalem unexplained until you read the history of who built it and why he built it and why he was thrown out of Islam. Okay, and then he has the gall to warn any future researchers that mosques who do not conform to these norms can be explained away by means of information on the local Qibla in treatises on folk astronomy and sacred geography, or treatises on mathematical astronomy from available medieval geographical data using extant or approximate mathematical methods. Listen to this. In such investigations, no conclusion should be drawn based on actual Qibla directions calculated from modern geographical data using some kind of exact mathematical procedure. Also, measurements and calculations to the nearest degree are adequate for investigative purposes. Any attempt to greater accuracy is unrealistic. So he wants you to throw out the data that may influence research in another direction. He only wants information that conforms to what the medieval mathematicians say. And that's fine. Somebody should go ahead and do that. It's not my job. I'm not defending his theory. He concludes, without such information, it is not a little arrogant to suppose that one can make any sensible pronouncement regarding the reason behind the orientation or edifice that was built over a millennium ago. Woe betide anyone who claims to explain any medieval mosque orientation without realizing how complicated is the subject of orientations. At the very end, Dr. King includes a very lengthy list of books and articles and websites on historical data, Qibla determinations to help future researchers. I don't know about you. I'm exhausted as I go through this paper. Now here are a couple of closing comments from myself. I and others have pored over the records left by the early Islamic writers. Never once are people instructed to face the Kaaba or to face in the same direction as the Kaaba faces. The term Masjid al-Haram is always used. The command is to turn your face towards Masjid al-Haram. Today, Dr. King is on a crusade to get us to think that early Muslims used the various sides of the Kaaba building, the building itself, to set their Qiblas, or maybe one of the way the wind blows, or some stars that are in the sky, or whatever. He and his few of his students are the only ones that seem to be promoting this. Never in any of the articles or books does Dr. King ever once give a reference to an early Islamic writer before the medieval times. He doesn't quote anybody other than the mathematical people in the Middle East. He doesn't quote the theologians and the historians and other people. All the Quran says is turn your face to Masjid al-Haram. 99% of Muslims today understand this means turn your face to Masjid al-Haram in Mecca and Saudi Arabia. Now, a few people are considering what I'm suggesting, that first Masjid al-Haram may have been in Petra. Friends, thousands of Muslims are not flocking to Dr. King's definition. Many Muslims consider his definition to be heretical. Facing a Qibla based on a Roman street map or a Roman street orientation is beyond belief. That Muslims hated everything to do with Romans and everything they stood for. This just demonstrates how out of touch Dr. King seems to be to people who know Islamic history and the thoughts and the understandings of Muslims around the world, all down through history. And when I discovered the possibility that the first Qiblas faced a direction other than Petra, I started to do comprehensive research. I wanted to find evidence that would disprove what I thought I was seeing. When I read Dr. King's explanation of Qiblas, I considered it even more crazy than my own. I couldn't find anything in Islamic history to support his theory outside of the writings of a few mathematicians 400 and 500 years after the fact. And it appeared to me that they were all making guesses as to how the earlier people did it. So at this time, I turned to Islamic history, laying the different Qiblas over Islamic history to find out what had happened at that time, what was going on. I started to check archaeology, and it seemed to me that my theory fit. I'm very happy to discuss my findings with others. I have posted my email address on the internet. I have attempted to answer questions. Thousands of Muslims have responded. Well, hundreds and hundreds have responded. I haven't counted up how many emails I've gotten and answered. I know there's 200 emails waiting to be answered. But the bitter opposition I am facing is not from Muslims, but from Dr. King. Going through his many pages of rants and accusations has been most taxing, but I'm happy that his theory is there. It's one opinion. I beg you, please, though, don't throw out other findings. It is important, if this topic is important to you, search it out, check it out. You don't have to accept what I say, but please don't accept other people's claims based on criticisms. Look at what is the data. What proof does he have that this is what people were doing? I'm Dan Gibson, And this has been the final video in a 6-video series addressing the writings of Dr. King and his criticisms of the Petra theory. Thank you for watching.